Join the coven. The Lighthouse Chapel. A story written by drunktillTuesday. We knew we weren't supposed to go there. We had been informed, no, instructed, to not go under the lighthouse every summer since we were kids. But we were kids back then. There was always something to do. My twin Lucy and I were a little more grown up this summer, and we were bored. Our parents had some booze cruise to go on. They said it was a one-day trip, just sailing around a couple of neighboring harbors and meeting up with old friends. We were thrilled to have them out of our hair. As we grew, our parents became so much more embarrassing to us. Mom with her flowing skirts and gaudy costume jewelry, trying to fit into the classy snob society of Camden, and failing by a long shot. Dad with his Hawaiian shirts, his terrible jokes, and his stinky off-brand cigars. They were both impossible to be around. My sister and I didn't fit in any better, but at least we knew it. So when they asked us if we, a couple of do-gooder 17-year-olds, would be fine alone for an entire day, we emphatically said hell yes. Concerned with our enthusiasm, but not concerned enough to skip another day with the Camden elite, my parents pranced off in their ridiculous outfits with their $20 bottle of wine, leaving us to our own devices. So, what are we going to do today? I asked Lucy the minute the front door closed. She rolled her eyes at me. We've done everything there is to do in Camden. I'm going to sunbathe and read, and you're going to leave me alone, T. Lucy huffed. I almost laughed at how ridiculous she sounded, but knew it would only make my twin angry. Aw, come on, big sis, I pleaded, using her 2-minute age advantage to my favor. You don't want to spend some time with your little bro? Time that doesn't involve being embarrassed by your rents for once? Lucy looked at me and sighed. What did you have in mind, little bro? She mocked. She knew I had pulled that card to get her on my side, and she knew it had worked. I chuckled in response, just a little, and told her, So, I'm thinking we go to the lighthouse. Lucy groaned. Jesus, T, we've been to that lighthouse twice every summer since before we were born. There's nothing about that lighthouse I don't know. Why do we need to go again? I looked in my twin sister's amber eyes and waited for her to be done ranting. I know all about how many rocks it took to make the pier. I know how long it took, how it radically changed the town's fishing economy and brought in more tourist money. I know how long the lighthouse has been there and how much money it took to make the pier leading to the lighthouse. Hell, at this point, I even know all the tour guides' names, and Randy has been there for like 160 years. Lucy took a deep breath and stopped talking. I waited a moment, then spoke. Wow, Luce, you are really dramatic. She rolled her eyes at me again, waiting for my big reveal. We will go to the chapel, I whispered. Lucy's eyes widened, and she stared at me, speechless for a full minute. Are you crazy? She finally busted out. The chapel? The chapel? The chapel? Lucy stood up and started pacing around our tiny summer home's living room. The chapel that Mom has said to never go to 1,000,000 times? Pace. The chapel that Dad threatened to murder us if he found out we ever went there? Pace. The chapel our lunatic parents have been demanding we never, ever visit? Pace. The chapel that the tour guide won't take us to, no matter how much money you have and no matter how long you've lived there? Pace. The chapel that everyone in town whispers crazy things about? That chapel, T? That chapel? Pace. Lucy spun around to face me, wagging her finger in front of my face accusingly. Are you crazy, Thomas Green? She hissed. My twin. So dramatic. I'm not crazy, Lucy Green. I'm bored, and you are too. Mom and Dad aren't here. It's a little windy and a little rainy out. There won't be a bunch of tourists trying to get to the lighthouse. And we know all of the tour guides. We could sneak away at any time. Lucy stared at me, her mouth hanging wide open, her finger limp in the air, flabbergasted. After a very long moment of silence, she flung up her hands in desperation. A sure sign I had won. Fine. We threw on ball caps and some tourist garb in an attempt to hide who we were. I'm not sure why, considering most of the town knew what we looked like. Seeing as we were the only family, tourists included most years, who couldn't afford to dress to the nines everywhere we went. It made us feel safer, I guess, trying to hide in plain sight. We biked out to the pier after creating a plan. Truthfully, we wanted to sneak into the lighthouse's chapel for as long as I could remember, but never had seen the opportunity to do so. Plus, I wanted Lucy there to see it with me, and she had been pushing me away for a few years. We decided we would mill around the back of whatever tour group was being let in next. There was always a line, as the lighthouse was one of the few free attractions in Camden. We never saw the word free in it, as they demanded a monetary donation the minute you step into the lighthouse. But our parents kept bringing us back every year anyway. When our group was being let in, we would wait until the very last minute and then slip away. The chapel was under the lighthouse. The entrance on the outside. We would have to climb the slippery steps on the side of the lighthouse, quickly and quietly, down to the water where the door was. Our plan kind of petered out there, because what if the door was locked? Lucy and I learned how to pick locks from some sketchy YouTube channels a long time ago. But we weren't sure we wanted to take this little adventure as far as breaking and entering. But I reasoned with Lucy. If no one ever went to the chapel anymore, then we shouldn't get busted. I think Lucy was excited about going too, because she agreed to take it as far as we needed to. Usually, she was a stickler for the rules. Surely, the rumors floating around town were all bull. The families that had lived in Camden for centuries whispered about a chapel that claimed your soul and your sanity if you stayed in it longer than a prayer. They said the chapel would be flooded with cement from the outside, or boarded up or destroyed so no one could ever get in. Some of the historic families even suggested tearing the whole evil lighthouse down. Let the ocean take it. make the town right again. Our parents never weighed in on the rumors, but like every other family in Camden, they insisted we never go to the chapel. I almost felt bad breaking their trust, but at the same time, I had a strong feeling that we would find nothing in the chapel. No ghosts, no ghouls, no evil demonic spirits feeding on our souls. We would find a few soggy and dusty Bibles, take a few pictures of our victory, and leave. I told Lucy as much, mumbling under my breath at the back of the tourist group. She nodded, agreeing with me. She nervously fidgeted with her hair. The chances of us getting caught were a little higher today because the group was a lot smaller than usual. Based off the tour guide's voice, yelling at the group from the lighthouse doorway, we figured it was either Randy or Bob. If it was Randy, we were screwed. He had eyes like a hawk and treated the lighthouse like his living, breathing child. If it was Bob, we'd be okay as long as any tourists that saw us didn't rat us out. Bob was a newer guide and didn't seem nearly as attached to the job as Randy did. Finally, right before I thought Lucy was going to bail on me from nerves, the tour guide stopped rambling on about the history of the pier and started ushering the group into the lighthouse. Lucy and I hung back, looking out at the waves and watching fat raindrops soak the pier around us. It was about to storm. We would have to be quick. "Now," I whispered to Lucy. We bolted for the side of the lighthouse. The tour guide was Bob, and he was talking with the family in front of us. He seemed completely unaware that there had been 2 more individuals in the group a few seconds ago. Lucy and I walked swiftly around the lighthouse. The path was thin and slick, with no guardrail, until we reached the top of the stairs. We could see the waves crashing at the bottom of the stairs, right in front of a tall metal door. We would have to time it just right to get that door open in between waves. "Be careful!" Lucy's shrill whisper pierced my ear over the wind and the waves, and I went to grab the metal guardrail. It was freezing and very wet. I gripped onto it tightly as I took the first few stone steps, gingerly. "It's slippery. You be careful," I shouted back to her. My heart was racing and the gravity of the situation was setting in. A storm was brewing, and we were trying to break into the part of the lighthouse that was basically under the water. I had no idea if we'd be able to get out the same way we came in. Lucy bolted down after me, and we slipped and slid until we were a few stairs from the bottom. Waves were crashing in earnest against the stone and the door, soaking us in the process. I was cold, so I knew Lucy was freezing. "Now!" I shouted to Lucy. I bolted down the remaining steps as the last of a wave drenched the ground. I wrenched at the door, and it opened easily, surprisingly. Lucy slid in after me, almost slipping on the wet stones. We slammed the door behind us as another wave hit. Half of it made its way inside, soaking our shoes and splashing against the floor of the chapel. We stood there for a minute, breathing heavily, with our hands slapped against the chapel door. When we caught our breath, Lucy and I high-fived. "We made it," I whooped. Lucy shushed me, but laughed along with me. We turned to face the chapel. It smelled awful, exactly as I would imagine a long-abandoned room would smell, mixed with salt water and a tinge of mold. Lucy waved her hand in front of her face and blew air out of her mouth. Gross. The chapel was too dark for us to see anything but each other. We pulled out our phones and flipped on the flashlights, waving the light at the ground to see where we were going. "My phone is gonna die soon," Lucy complained. "You never charge the damn thing," I hissed at her as my light shone on the wet green tile. "I didn't think we'd go on an adventure leading us to a pitch-black dungeon today, Thomas," she hissed back. I rolled my eyes at her in the dark and raised my flashlight. I heard Lucy gasp in horror before my brain fully wrapped around what I was looking at. Skulls. Row after row of human skulls adorned the walls of the chapel, grinning at us from the dark. I swept my flashlight around the room. The chapel, barely big enough to hold 3 long pews and 1 pulpit, was surrounded with skulls. The worst part was, I couldn't see any other door except for the one we had just slammed closed against some waves. Are those baby skulls?" Lucy shrieked. Her light was dipping up and down. When I looked at her, I saw she was crying and panicked, her hands shaking too badly to hold her light straight. I looked where she was pointing and saw that, sure enough, there were all different sizes of skulls in the walls. Infant skulls, toddler skulls, teenage skulls, adult skulls, in no particular order, fastened to the chapel walls. "Holy hell," I whispered. "We have to get out of here now," Lucy shrieked again. She was getting louder and louder. To make it all worse, her phone died almost immediately. "Oh my God," Lucy screamed. I watched as she slammed her hand into her phone, trying to turn it back on somehow. "Lucy, calm down," I told her. I reached for my twin, wanting to comfort her and calm her down. My feet tangled beneath me on the slick floor, and I went down, hard. My head clipped the edge of the pew nearest us, and I went out like a light. I came to with no idea how long I had been out. I was under long enough for the blood on either side of my face to have caked and cooled. I was colder than I had ever been. It took a second to get my bearings. My neck hurt badly. Every moment sent a sharp pain from my shoulder blade to my neck and into the base of my skull. The pain echoed through my temples, and I winced, shutting my eyes against the buzz. "Lucy?" I whispered. My throat was scratchy, voice raw. "Lucy, where are you?" I cracked open my eyes and sat up a little farther. My body screamed in protest, but I couldn't hear Lucy at all. My phone was near my hand, and I grabbed it up. The screen was shattered. The camera lens cracked when I fell, I guess. The flashlight was still on, but it was dim, with barely enough light for me to see my hand in front of my face. I couldn't tell what time it was. "Lucy?" I called out again, a little louder this time. My throat protested, but I cleared it a few times and finally shouted her name for the 4th time. No response. I stood on shaky legs as my whole body shivered from the cold and the pain. Towards the front of the chapel, behind the pulpit, I could make out a small, flickering light. "Luce?" I whispered. I hobbled towards the pulpit, straining my ears to hear something, anything over the throbbing in my own ears. I could hear chattering, like teeth knocking together. I knew Lucy had to be even colder than I was, even with cold blood on my face. I had always ran hot. Lucy did not. "Why aren't you answering me?" I reached the pulpit and peered around it. Lucy had found and lit a small candle somehow, and she was huddled close to it. Her hair hung around her face. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but I heard her mumbling something. "Hey, Lucy!" I reached down and shook her shoulder. Her head snapped back, and she looked at me with inhuman eyes. Her pupils were wide, devouring most of her irises. The gorgeous amber color I was so used to, that I adored in my own face, was almost entirely gone. Her eyes lacked emotion and recognition. She seemed to stare right through me. The muscles in her face were slack, and she didn't appear to be breathing. She just kept mumbling something to herself, over and over again. "Lucy?" I whispered. I was frightened, horrified. What the hell had happened to my twin? It was then that I noticed the chattering sound was still going on. It wasn't Lucy's teeth cracking together in cold, like I originally thought. I took my flashlight and stepped past Lucy, shining the light on the wall to try and locate the source of the sound. I found it immediately. The skulls were all opening and closing their jaws, the teeth of hundreds of dead people clacking together in unison. The more I stared, the louder it got. It was deafening. Lucy's murmuring ripped me away from my stupor. I stumbled away from the wall and collapsed on the ground next to Lucy. She had her arms crossed in front of her, gripping herself tightly as she rocked back and forth. She stared into the candle and muttered away. The louder the skulls got, the louder Lucy got, until eventually Lucy was screaming at the top of her lungs. She ripped her arms away from her chest and slammed her hands over her ears, rocking even more violently than before. I could finally make out what she was saying as I covered my own ears to shield my throbbing head from all the noise. "Evil will slay the wicked. Evil will slay the wicked. Evil will slay the wicked. Evil will slay the wicked." "Lucy, stop! Stop!" I grabbed at Lucy, trying to ignore the shrieking, shattering sounds of bone on bone. I shook her shoulders, shook her again. When she wouldn't acknowledge me, she stayed where she was, rocking away with her hands glued to her ears, shrieking the same sentence over and over again. "Evil will slay the wicked." "Lucy!" I screamed at her, shaking her violently. I could hear the panic in my voice. I knew we had to get out of here. I ignored the pain shooting through my body and struggled to my feet. I bent down and pulled Lucy from the ground. She refused to pull her hands away from her ears and wouldn't look at me. "Evil will slay the wicked." I pulled Lucy in the direction of the metal door, our only way out. We needed help, and I was going to get it for us. As soon as I stepped past the pulpit and brought Lucy with me, the skulls stopped gnashing their teeth. The silence was as deafening as their noise. I peered around in the dark, unsure of what was about to happen. Every hair on my body was standing on end. Lucy was still covering her ears, whispering her little sentence to herself instead of screaming it again. I pulled her closer to the door. I wasn't sure whether the storm was over or if it was worse than before. I wasn't sure where the tide was at. I hesitated at the door, worried I might be about to flood us, trap us in the chapel for a long, long time. As soon as I touched the doorknob, the skulls started chanting. I know it doesn't make sense. How could remains speak? But they did, and their words boomed and echoed through the chamber. "Return to your rest." Lucy shrieked and answered them with, "Evil will slay the wicked." "Return to your rest." The skulls echoed again, Lucy started convulsing, shrieking and crying and repeating herself. It was like she was trying to drown out their message. A message I didn't understand. Return to your rest. Return to your rest. Return to your rest. Evil will slay the wicked. Evil will slay the wicked. Evil will slay the wicked. I ripped open the door. We were greeted by sunshine, and both the Skulls and Lucy stopped chanting as soon as the door opened. Instead of repeating herself, Lucy went catatonic. She collapsed at the foot of the stairs that, luckily, the waves had stopped pummeling. I dragged her limp form a few stairs up in case another wave did come, and went for help. The tour group and a new tour guide, a man I didn't recognize, Bob's shift had been over hours before, were so stunned by what I was telling them at first that they didn't believe me. The group stared at me with their expensive outfits and their shiny jewelry, their mouths open in total disbelief. The blood caked on my face must have convinced them, because finally the tour guide broke away and went into action. He made several calls immediately and then followed me back to the stairs to pull Lucy up to safety. By the time we had laid her on the ground in the lighthouse, I was incredibly dizzy and my vision was starting to go. Lucy still hadn't woken up. The next few days were a blur. I was put on bed rest and watched constantly in the local hospital. I had fractured my skull, was suffering through a severe concussion, and the vision in my right eye kept coming and going without reason. Lucy was moved to a different hospital, a psychiatric one. Apparently, when she finally did wake up, she wouldn't talk to anyone. She wouldn't speak at all. My parents and the doctors had listened intently to my story, since Lucy couldn't tell any part of it, and shook their heads at me. The doctors were surprised I was alive, and my parents were disappointed in us, but worried sick over Lucy and my recovery. They asked me over and over again what had possessed me to go to the chapel, the one place everyone in town knew not to go. I didn't have an answer for them. On my last night in the hospital, I heard my nurses whispering outside the door. I knew they were talking about Lucy when I heard them say, insane. They went on to say she was barely human, that she didn't have a soul anymore. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them to mind their own business, and not to make lies up about my twin. I can't claim that the people of Camden were spewing nonsense about the chapel anymore, though Lucy still hasn't been released.